Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 44 of Days Gone By on Gran Turismo 6, and this particular pick is for a very iconic Italian car, one of the most iconic, if not possibly even the most iconic classic Alfa Romeo, the classic 60s GTA. This is a car which I've always considered to be kind of the Alfa Romeo equivalent of the BMW 2002 Turbo. And that's not really for any particular historical or mechanical reason, it's just because I think they have a fairly similar overall style, look and shape. They are essentially both classic, compact sports coupes with a pretty rich racing history. The Alfa Romeo probably more so in that regard, but I've always just kind of thought of them as similar in that way. That's not necessarily a well-founded comparison, but it's always a comparison that I've made. Now this particular car has some pretty good numbers, not necessarily as impressive as some other classics, but this is the kind of car which just isn't a speed machine. It's not designed for straight line performance, it doesn't give you incredible straight line performance, but that's not what it's about. This is a car which I would say is good for two things. The first one is being a collector's piece. This is an essential car for any Alfa Romeo fan. I would say actually an essential for any classic fan in their collection. And I would actually also say it makes a pretty decent track car. Now, I will put a caveat on that. It's a good track car with the right tuning and under the right circumstances. Now you could say that to some degree about any car, really, but there are some vehicles, and I think most people would agree, that basically just fall into their own natural place on the food chain quite easily. Stuff like the Tomicara ZZ2, the Nissan GTR, the Suzuki GSX-R4, the Dome Zero. They're cars which just naturally fall right into line to be really useful, really competitive, and just great cars to own and use. Other cars, not so much. Other cars can be a bit trickier to know when and where to use them. Stuff more like the Lancia Stratos, the Volkswagen Samba bus, and to some degree I would say this vehicle as well. Now it definitely has its uses in the lower PP levels, and I would actually recommend using this car, especially for beginners, at lower PP levels, at least initially. Once you've built up a rapport with the car, you know how to use it better, maybe you just become more fluent, not just with this car but with the way classics handle, the way that they're different to modern cars, the way that they are more mechanical and it's more down to you as a driver rather than letting, to some degree, the modern electronics and advancements of newer cars do the work for you to some degree. And although not all modern cars do that, the majority of them do. An old school car is much more about you putting the work in. And although there are a couple of exceptions, cars which were advanced for their time, this is definitely one of those vehicles which, like the Stratos as an example, but definitely not as challenging as the Stratos, does require careful setup and practice. This is a car which, when you tune it and drive it properly, can absolutely fly around the track. But if you tune it maybe incorrectly, if you don't have enough experience driving it, or maybe if you just don't drive it in the right way, with enough respect for the handling, or if you're not smooth enough with your driving, well then it can bite back. Now as far as sheer numbers, you're looking at modest numbers. Good numbers for a classic, especially a smaller one, but modest numbers in the broad scheme of this series, especially when we're also featuring cars like classic American cars with big engines, big power, classic Japanese cars with big power like the Toyota 7. It really is a very disparate series. You've got cars all over the place in terms of power and performance. This is a much more modest one. You're looking at a 1.6 litre turbo, it's rear wheel drive, which I think is a very good thing. A front wheel drive version would have been easier to drive, but it wouldn't have had the passion that the rear wheel drive has. Now, fully tuned, that 1.6 engine puts out 285 horsepower, so as I said, definitely not bad, but not mind-blowing. 214 pound-feet of torque, and it is very light. It only weighs 662 kilos, which is one of the most impressive facts about this car. That lightweight package means that even with less power, you've got a lot more to work with in terms of cornering ability. Basically the exact same advantage that the Suzuki GSX-R4 has. It's just such a lightweight vehicle that you don't need a ridiculous amount of power. Other vehicles like the Ginetta G4 also showcase that same advantage. Now the horsepower per tonne on this car is still really impressive. 431 horsepower per tonne is really good for a classic, especially of its power, and that's mainly due to just how good that weight is. But another one of the reasons why I would recommend being careful how far you take the tuning of this car, in particular the upgrades obviously, and also how high you choose to race it, is due to how high the PP can go. Now this car doesn't have Red Bull Junior syndrome, as I refer to it. It's certainly not ridiculously high, but at 524 pp in its fully tuned state, I would say that that is too high. It's not ridiculous, it's workable, and I can understand why it's that high given how quick the car is and how light it is, but I definitely wouldn't recommend racing it at that level, because as good as it is in its own way, it just doesn't have the straight line performance in particular to rival really anything at that level, not unless the other cars are also slow. So overall, this is a car which I would say up to, say, maybe 500 pp, definitely 475, and basically the lower you get after that the better. It really can be an excellent car. The handling is superb when tuned correctly. It's so light, compact, and has a very low centre of gravity, plus the fact that this isn't a normal production classic. This isn't like taking something like a Mini, for instance, and upgrading it. This is a specific sports vehicle. So although it is expensive at 113 grand, it's definitely a great collector's piece that can prove very useful. But that's it overall for this particular pick. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.